The heat off the asphalt bent the air into ribbons along County Road 9, 3 miles west of Fredericksburg, Texas, where a man knelt in the dirt beside a motorcycle that was not his own. His name was Clay Tanner. He was 38 years old, and his hands were black to the wrists with grease, and he had not spoken a word in 4 minutes. The woman standing over him held a helmet under one arm and a fold of cash in her free hand. Clay pulled the spark plug, checked the gap, blew the carbon off, and threaded it back in. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stood up. She extended the money. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "It's running," he said. She pushed the cash forward again. He shook his head once, turned, and walked back toward his truck. What she was hiding will change everything he thought he knew. And what he buried in a filing cabinet years ago will save everything she is about to lose. Stay for the whole story. Clay Tanner's shop sat on a quarter-acre of gravel and hard-packed dirt at the south end of Main Street in Fredericksburg, between a feed store that had been closed since 2019 and a house belonging to a retired Air Force mechanic named Roy Tatum. The sign out front read Tanner Cycle and Repair, and the letters were hand-painted, and one of them had started to peel. He had opened the shop in the fall of 22, 3 months after his wife Emily was killed by a pickup truck that ran a red light on Route 16. He had been in Fort Worth at the time, sitting in an exit interview at Halcyon Aerospace, where he had spent 9 years as a senior propulsion engineer before the company restructured Division 7 out of existence. He signed the severance paperwork at 11 in the morning. He got the call about Emily at 11:42. He never went back to aerospace. Not because the work had failed him, but because the world around the work had become a place he could no longer stand to be in. So he moved to Fredericksburg, bought the quarter-acre, and started fixing motorcycles. His daughter Josie was 9 years old. She had her mother's brown hair and her father's habit of going quiet when she was thinking. Most afternoons, she sat at the workbench in the back of the shop with a collection of salvaged engine parts, bolts, scraps of aluminum, and she built model airplanes. Not from kits, from whatever was lying around. She was careful with her hands, and she never asked Clay to help, though sometimes he stood behind her and watched, and she knew he was there, and neither of them said anything about it. Clay's routine was simple. He opened the shop at 7. He picked Josie up from school at 3. He closed at 5. On Saturdays, he and Josie drove to the farmer's market on East Main and bought peaches, and on Sundays they did nothing at all, and that was enough. Roy Tatum, who was 64 and had spent 30 years fixing aircraft for the Air Force before retiring to Fredericksburg, lived next door and kept an eye on things without being asked. He had known Clay for nearly 4 years, and in that time had learned 2 facts that Clay never volunteered. That Clay had once worked on systems that flew faster than sound, and that Clay would rather sand rust off a fuel tank all day than talk about it. Kate Alderman had been on the road for 11 days when her motorcycle broke down on County Road 9. She was 34 years old, and she was the founder and chief executive of Alderman Ventures, a technology investment firm based in Dallas with $3.4 billion under management. She had built the firm from a single office and a line of credit her father had co-signed before he died. 6 months before the breakdown, she had ended an engagement to a man who, she eventually realized, had proposed to her balance sheet rather than to her. She told her board she was taking personal time. She bought a used motorcycle. She rode south. She came back to Clay's shop the next morning. Not because the bike was running rough, it was running fine. She said she wanted a full tune-up, a proper one, not a roadside patch. Clay quoted her a fair price. She did not negotiate. He noticed. She stood by the bench and watched him strip the carburetor, and she asked questions, specific ones, about jet sizes and float levels, that told him she knew engines, or at least knew how to learn about them quickly. Josie was at the workbench, fitting a piece of aluminum sheeting to a wing. Kate looked over, and Josie looked up, and Kate waved, and Josie waved back, and that was all. While Clay worked, Kate's phone buzzed 3 times in her pocket. She silenced it each time without looking. Clay finished the tune-up at noon. He handed her the keys. She paid in cash, exact change plus a 20 for the roadside job the day before. He took it this time. She rode off down Main Street, and Clay stood in the bay door watching the road long after the sound of the engine had dissolved into the heat. Roy, sitting on his porch with a glass of iced tea, said nothing. But he watched Clay watching, and that was enough to tell him something had shifted. 3 days later, Clay needed to order a replacement gasket for the carburetor float bowl, a standard part, but the bike was a European model, and the supplier required a VIN match for compatibility. He typed the number into the dealer's system and waited. The registration came back attached to a corporate fleet account. Alderman Ventures, LLC, Dallas, Texas. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he opened a browser tab and typed the company name. The first result was a Forbes profile from 23. The photograph showed the same woman who had stood in his shop 3 days earlier. Same face, same steady expression, same way of holding herself like she was the only person in any room who already knew what was going to happen next. Net worth, $3.4 billion. Founder and CEO, youngest woman to take a private technology fund past the $2 billion mark. 2 pages of board seats, keynote speeches, and acquisitions that had made the front page of the financial press. Clay closed the browser. He closed the dealer's tab. He sat in the chair behind the counter and looked out through the bay door at Main Street, where a woman on a motorcycle had ridden past that morning without knowing that the man who had fixed her spark plug was now sitting in a metal chair in a Texas shop, holding a fact about her that he had no intention of using. When Kate came by 2 days later to check on the gasket order, he treated her exactly the same way he had before. He told her the part would be in by Thursday. She said she would come back Thursday. He said that was fine. Nothing in his voice moved. Nothing in his manner changed. She noticed, not the shift, but the absence of one. He was the first person in 6 months who had looked at her without calculating, and he was still doing it, and she did not yet understand how rare that was. Kate had been asking around town. The woman at the diner on East Main told her Clay had showed up about 4 years ago, bought the lot, opened the shop, kept to himself. No one knew where he had come from. No one asked. This was Fredericksburg, and people here understood that a man who did not talk about his past had reasons that were his own. That evening, Roy sat on his porch while Clay locked up. That woman, Roy said. She's not just passing through. She's hiding from something. Clay pulled the shop door shut and turned the deadbolt. So was I, he said. Roy said nothing else, because nothing else was needed. From inside the shop, through the closed window, they heard the faint sound of a phone ringing. Kate's, across the street at the motel. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice was low and carried only one line through the glass. I said I'll be back when I'm ready. Then silence. Then the click of the call ending. Clay did not mention it. Roy did not either. But both of them heard it, and both of them understood that whatever Kate Alderman was running from had not stopped running after her. But what Clay did not know, what he could not have known, standing in the gravel lot with his hands still smelling of solvent, was that the person on the other end of that phone call was already making plans to come to Fredericksburg. And when he arrived, he would bring with him a secret that had been buried inside Clay's own past for 7 years. Kate extended her stay at the motel by a week. She did not explain why, and the woman at the front desk did not ask. By the 4th day, Kate had developed a routine of her own. Coffee at the diner at 7:30, a ride through the hill country until mid-morning, then the shop. She started coming to Clay's Bay not for repairs. There was nothing wrong with the bike. She came because the shop was quiet, and Clay did not fill silence with questions, and the work he did with his hands had a rhythm that she found steadying in a way she could not quite explain to herself. On the 5th day, he was rebuilding a carburetor from a 1971 Honda CB350 that a rancher had brought in from a barn outside Stonewall. Kate stood beside the bench and watched him disassemble it, piece by piece, laying each component on a clean shop rag in the order it came out. Show me, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he slid the rag closer to her side of the bench. He walked her through it. The float, the needle valve, the jets, the throttle slide, the way each piece depended on every other piece to do its job. She listened the way engineers listen, asking questions only when something did not make mechanical sense to her. She learned fast. By the end of the afternoon, she had reassembled the float bowl herself, and Clay had checked her work and found nothing to correct. He set the carburetor on the shelf and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything about how natural it had been to stand that close to each other for 3 hours without it meaning anything, or meaning everything. They did not talk about Dallas. They did not talk about Halcyon. They talked about float heights and idle mixture screws and the specific sound a two-stroke makes when the timing is off by half a degree. And in that shared language of machinery and precision, something settled between them that neither of them named. Kate's phone rang twice during the afternoon. Both times, the screen showed the same name, Neil Pryor. Both times, she silenced it. The second time, Clay saw the name on the screen before she turned it over. He said nothing. She said nothing. But when she left that evening, she paused in the doorway of the shop and looked back at him. And he was already looking at her. And for a moment the space between them went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Then she put on her helmet and rode back to the motel, and Clay swept the floor and locked up, and the shop was quiet again. On a Sunday evening in the second week, Clay and Kate rode together for the first time. She followed him on the European bike, and he led on an old Triumph Bonneville he had rebuilt the year before, and they took the back road south of town where the hills rolled out in long golden waves under a sky that was turning copper at the edges. They stopped at a pull-off above the Pedernales River, where the limestone shelf dropped away and the water ran shallow over flat rock, and Clay cut his engine, and Kate cut hers, and for a while they just sat there, side by side, watching the light change over the valley. "I left Dallas because I couldn't tell anymore," she said. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the water. "Everyone around me wanted something. And after a while, I stopped being able to tell who was real and who was just positioned. I don't mean they were bad people. I mean I couldn't see them clearly. And I couldn't see myself either. So I bought a bike and I rode until the road ran out of noise." Clay was quiet for a long time. The river made a low sound below them, and the wind moved through the juniper on the far bank. Then he said, "I used to build things. Complex things. Systems that had to work the first time, every time, because if they didn't, people got hurt." He paused. "And then I lost someone. And the work didn't stop matching, but everything around the work did. The meetings. The reviews. The people who wanted my name on things so their names could be next to it. So I came here, and I started fixing things that were small enough to hold in my hands." She did not ask what he had built. He did not ask what she had left. The honesty was in what they chose not to explain, in the trust that the other person's silence was not evasion but respect, and that the things they were not saying were the things that mattered most. The sun dropped below the ridge line, and the air cooled, and they rode back to Fredericksburg in the dark with their headlights cutting narrow paths through the hill country night. The next morning, Roy set out 2 coffee mugs on his porch railing instead of 1. Clay saw them when he walked to the shop at 6:45. He picked up his mug and drank. Roy sat in his chair and watched the road. "She rides well," Roy said. Clay nodded. That was all. But something had shifted, not in any way that either of them acknowledged, but in the space between them at the bench, in the half-second pause before one of them spoke, in the way her hand steadied the wrench while he set the torque and neither of them pulled away. They were not touching. They were not close to touching. But in a town this small, in a life this quiet, the absence of distance was its own kind of language. The black SUV arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before Thanksgiving. It pulled up in front of the motel at 8:15 and parked in the space closest to the office door. 2 men in dark jackets got out of the back. A third, older, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that did not belong anywhere near Fredericksburg, got out of the front passenger side and stood on the sidewalk and looked up and down Main Street the way a man looks at a piece of property he is considering acquiring. His name was Neil Pryor. He was 52 years old, and he had been the chief operating officer of Alderman Ventures for 16 years. Kate's father had hired him when the firm had 6 employees and $200 million under management. Neil had helped build it into what it was. He had also, over the past 3 years, been building something of his own, but that part would come later. He found Kate in the motel parking lot. "The Ridgepoint board vote is in 10 days, he said, without greeting. "We need your signature on the expanded commitment. $38 million is already allocated, Kate. The next tranche requires a principal sign-off." Kate did not turn around immediately. She finished fastening a bag to the motorcycle's rear rack, then straightened and faced him. "I told you I'd review remotely. Remote doesn't work for this. The board wants you in the room. Then the board can wait." Neil looked past her, down the street, toward the shop. The motorcycle, her motorcycle, was parked inside the bay. A man in a worn gray t-shirt was rolling a toolbox across the concrete floor. "Who is that?" Neil asked. "The mechanic," Kate said. Neil studied the shop for a moment longer than was casual. Then he turned back to Kate. 10 days, he said. He got in the SUV. The 2 associates followed. The vehicle pulled out of the lot and turned left on Main, and as it passed Tanner's Cycle and Repair, Neil looked through the window at Clay for exactly 2 seconds. Clay was not looking back. He was adjusting a chain tensioner on a customer's bike. "But Roy," sitting on his porch with the morning paper folded on his knee, saw Neil's face through the glass, and what he saw in it was not curiosity. It was calculation. That afternoon, Neil's associates spent 2 hours in town. They ate lunch at the diner. They asked the waitress about the mechanic on Main Street. They visited the county clerk's office and pulled property records on the shop lot. They drove past Tanner's cycle twice. Roy watched all of it from his porch and said nothing until Clay came out to lock up at 5. "Your friend's boss came to town today," Roy said. "I saw. His people spent the afternoon asking about you." Clay turned the deadbolt. "Let them ask." That evening, Kate came to the shop after closing. She stood in the bay door while Clay cleaned his tools. "My COO showed up this morning," she said. It was the first time she had directly referenced her corporate life to him. "He wants me back in Dallas for a board vote." Clay set down the wrench he was holding. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know who you are," he said. "I figured it out 2 weeks ago. The VIN on your bike is registered to Alderman Ventures. I looked it up when I ordered the gasket." Kate did not move. The air in the shop went very still. "And you didn't say anything." "Wasn't mine to say." She stood there for a long time, and then she exhaled. Not a sigh, not relief, but something closer to the sound of a weight being set down carefully on a surface that could hold it. "Most people, when they find out, start performing," she said. "They get louder, or more careful, or they start asking for things." "I'm not most people," Clay said. "And you didn't come to Fredericksburg to be found out. You came here to be ordinary for a while. I wasn't going to take that from you." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them said anything else. After a moment, she turned and walked across the street to the motel. Clay stood in the bay door and watched her go. Roy, from his porch, did not say a word. But Neil Pryor was not finished with Fredericksburg. And what he had found in the county clerk's office, Clay Tanner's name, his purchase date, his previous address in Fort Worth, was only the beginning of something that neither of them saw coming. Neil Pryor sat in the back seat of the SUV at the edge of town the next morning and read the background report on his phone. Clayton James Tanner, Senior Propulsion Engineer, Halcyon Aerospace, Division 7, Fort Worth, 2012 through 21. Specialization, High Mach Thermal Management Systems. Lead designer on the XR9 platform, a scramjet propulsion architecture intended for sustained flight above Mach 2. Division 7 was dissolved in a corporate restructuring in 21. Tanner resigned during the transition. No disciplinary record. No termination. Clean exit. Neil read the file twice. Then he drove back to Main Street. Clay was in the bay, replacing a stator on a Harley Sportster, when the SUV pulled up outside the shop. Neil got out alone this time. He walked in without knocking and stood on the other side of the workbench and looked down at Clay the way a man looks at something he is deciding whether to step on or step around. "I know who you are, too," Neil said. "Halcyon, Division 7. You designed the XR9 thermal management package." Clay did not look up from the stator. "That's right. So what's a propulsion engineer doing fixing motorcycles in a town with 2 stoplights?" "Living," Clay said. Neil leaned forward. His voice dropped. "I'll be direct with you, Mr. Tanner. Kate Alderman is going through a difficult period. She doesn't need distractions. She needs to come back to Dallas and do her job. So whatever this is, the small-town charm, the grease under the fingernails routine, I'd suggest you stay in your lane." Clay set down the wrench. He stood up slowly. He was 4 inches taller than Neil, and his hands were still holding the weight of the tool. "You flew down here to tell me to stay in my lane. I flew down here to bring my CEO home. She's not yours to bring." Neil smiled, a smile that had nothing to do with warmth. "Fine. Let me put it another way. The Ridgepoint Aero commitment is the largest single allocation in Alderman's portfolio. $38 million. The board votes in 9 days. If Kate is not in that room, the vote stalls, and the firm takes a credibility hit it cannot afford. I am not going to let a mechanic in a nowhere town interfere with that." And then Neil said the words that changed everything. He said them casually, almost as an afterthought, the way a man drops a match without checking what is underneath it. Ridgepoint's XT14 propulsion platform passed 40 independent reviews. It's the most validated scramjet architecture on the market. Clay went still. His hand was on the edge of the workbench, and his fingers pressed into the steel. "Say that designation again." "XT14. What?" "Because I designed the thermal management package that architecture is built on. And I killed it myself." In 2019, at Halcyon, I filed the test abort report with the FAA. Neil's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. A recalculation, fast and cold. The design was revised. The issues were resolved in later development. The issues were not resolved, Clay said. His voice was level, without heat, the voice of a man reciting data he had memorized because the data had once been his responsibility. The ceramic matrix composite lining fails after 600 hours of sustained thermal load above Mach 2.4. It doesn't degrade gradually. It fractures. Catastrophically. I ran the test cycle 14 times at Halcyon's facility. 14 failures, same mode, same timeline. That's why I killed it. That's why the entire XR9 program was shelved. That was 7 years ago. Materials science has advanced. The failure mode is in the geometry, not the material. You can't fix it with better ceramics. The architecture itself is flawed. I wrote the report. My name is on every page. The shop door opened. Kate stood in the doorway. She had heard the last exchange, enough to understand what was happening. She looked at Neil. She looked at Clay. Then she said, in a voice that carried no emotion, only precision, "How much of Ridgepoint do you own, Neil?" Neil did not answer. And that silence, the silence of a man who had been caught standing in exactly the wrong place, was louder than anything he could have said. Kate sat at the desk in Clay's shop that evening with her laptop open and her phone on speaker with Alderman's general counsel in Dallas. Clay sat across from her with a legal pad and a pencil and drew diagrams of the XT-14's thermal management geometry, the same architecture he had designed at Halcyon 7 years earlier, the same one he had killed. He walked her through it in the precise, unhurried language of a man who had spent 9 years learning how to explain systems that could not afford to be misunderstood. The ceramic matrix composite lining was rated for sustained temperatures up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At Mach 2.4, the thermal load exceeded that threshold within the first 90 minutes of sustained flight. The lining held for approximately 600 hours of cumulative exposure before the crystalline structure began to fracture along the grain boundaries. The fracture pattern was not random. It was predictable, repeatable, and catastrophic. He had documented it 14 times in Halcyon's test facility between January and August of 2019. The FAA had the abort report on file, stamped and dated third quarter of that year. His name was listed as lead engineer on every page. Kate pulled Alderman's internal files on Ridgepoint Aero, the allocation memos, the due diligence reports, the board approval minutes from the previous year. She cross-referenced them against the capitalization table from Ridgepoint's Series A filing. There it was, on page 11. Prior Capital Partners LLC, 9% equity stake, acquired 18 months before the Alderman allocation. Neil Pryor's personal limited liability company. Undisclosed to Alderman's board. Undisclosed to the investment committee. Undisclosed to Kate. The $38 million investment had passed through 3 internal approval stages before reaching the board. Neil had overseen all 3. He had selected the outside technical reviewers. He had drafted the risk summary. He had presented the final recommendation. At no point in any document, any email, any memo, any presentation had he mentioned that he personally stood to gain tens of millions of dollars if Ridgepoint's valuation held. Kate closed the laptop slowly. She sat back in the chair and looked at the wall behind Clay's workbench for a long time. "He's been with this company since before I was CEO," she said quietly. "My father hired him. He was at the funeral." Clay said nothing. He set the pencil down on the legal pad and folded his hands on the table. Some things a person has to carry alone for a minute before they can set them down, and he understood that because he had carried his own weight for 4 years in exactly the same way. Roy called that evening from his kitchen. He had reached a contact at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a materials engineer he had served with in the 90s. The contact confirmed that Halcyon's XR9 program had been permanently shelved in 2019 due to unresolved thermal cycling failures in the propulsion lining. The documentation was in the FAA's certification database, publicly accessible, searchable by program designation. Clay's name was listed on the original test abort report as the lead engineer who had recommended permanent discontinuation. Kate called Neil at 9 that night. He answered on the second ring and started talking immediately. The engineering concerns had been addressed, the lining had been upgraded, the protocols had been refined. Kate listened for 30 seconds. Then she said, "The Series A cap table lists prior capital partners at 9%. You never disclosed that to the board." She ended the call before he finished his next sentence. Over the next 4 days, Kate built the case. She worked from the desk in Clay's shop during the day and from the motel at night, and the back of the bay became a second office with documents stacked on the workbench beside engine parts and shop racks. Clay provided the technical backbone, a one-page summary of the thermal cycling failure mode, written in the precise, emotionless language of an engineer documenting a known defect. He timestamped every data point against Halcyon's 2019 internal review and included the FAA filing number so the board's counsel could pull independent verification. Roy's contact at Wright-Patterson sent the FAA certification record by secure email, official, date-stamped, listing Clay as the engineer who had authored the original test aboard and recommended permanent shelving of the XR9 architecture. The same architecture that Ridgepoint Aero was now marketing under a new designation to the Department of Defense, with Alderman Ventures' $38 million behind it. On the third day, Neil made his move. He sent an email to every member of Alderman's board of directors stating that Clay Tanner had been terminated for cause from Halcyon Aerospace in 21 due to documented performance concerns and insubordination. The email recommended that any technical claims made by Tanner be treated as the biased opinions of a disgruntled former employee and disregarded entirely. Clay did not raise his voice when Kate showed him the email on her phone. He walked to the filing cabinet in the back of the shop, the steel one he had not opened in 3 years, the one that held the documents from his old life, and pulled out 2 pieces of paper. The first was his letter of resignation, dated September 14, 21, addressed to the Director of Division 7, signed by Clay and countersigned by the division head with the notation, "Accepted with regret. Outstanding performance throughout tenure." The second was the restructuring notice from Halcyon's corporate office, dated August 28, 21, confirming the dissolution of Division 7 and the offer of voluntary separation packages to all remaining personnel. Both documents were clean, dated, and unambiguous. Neil Pryor's email was a fabrication, and the proof had been sitting in a filing cabinet in a motorcycle repair shop in Fredericksburg, Texas, for 3 years, waiting for the moment it would matter. On the morning of the 5th day, Kate packed the motel room. She loaded her bag into a rental car she had arranged through the front desk. She walked to the shop one last time. Clay was in the bay, adjusting a valve on the Bonneville. She stood in the doorway. "I'm going to Dallas," she said. "The board meets tomorrow at 2. He nodded. He did not ask her to stay. He did not ask her to come back. He set the wrench down on the bench and looked at her, and the look carried everything that words would have made smaller. She looked at the motorcycle, her motorcycle, still parked in the bay where it had been since the day Neil arrived. "Keep the bike here," she said. "I'll need a reason to come back." She drove north on Route 16, and Clay stood in the bay door and watched the rental car until it disappeared over the first rise in the road, and then he went back to work. Because that was what Clay Tanner did. He worked, he waited, and he trusted that the things he had built, the things he had fixed, would hold. But what Kate had left behind in that shop was not just a motorcycle. It was a signal, the kind that does not require explanation, only trust. And Clay, who had spent 4 years learning how to live without signals from anyone, understood it perfectly. The boardroom at Alderman Ventures occupied the entire 42nd floor of a glass tower in uptown Dallas. And on the day of the vote, the late autumn light came through the south-facing windows in long flat bars that striped the conference table like the lines on a runway. Kate arrived at 8 in the morning, 6 hours before the meeting. She spent those hours with General Counsel, walking through the evidence package piece by piece. Clay's thermal cycling data, the FAA abort report, the Ridgepoint Series A cap table showing Neil's undisclosed equity, the 3 allocation memos Neil had shepherded through internal review, and Clay's one-page technical summary with the Halcyon timestamp and filing number. At 2 o'clock, the board convened. 9 directors around the table. Neil sat at Kate's right, where he had sat for 16 years, in the chair her father had first offered him. Kate did not begin with accusations. She began with the engineering. She put Clay's thermal cycling data on the conference screen and walked the board through the failure mode. 600 hours of cumulative exposure, catastrophic fracture of the ceramic lining, 14 documented test cycles at Halcyon's facility, all 14 ending in the same result. She showed them the FAA certification record with Clay's name and the filing date. Then she showed them Ridgepoint's XT14 specification sheet, filed in 22, and asked the board to compare the thermal management architecture line by line. They were identical. The design that Halcyon had shelved as fundamentally flawed was the same design Ridgepoint was now selling to the Department of Defense with Alderman's capital behind it. Then she showed them the cap table. Prior Capital Partners, LLC. 9% equity. Acquired before the Alderman allocation. Never disclosed. Neil spoke for 11 minutes. He said the engineering concerns had been resolved in subsequent development. He said the equity stake had been disclosed verbally to Kate's father before his death. He said the technical summary was the work of a terminated employee with a personal grievance against the industry. Kate's general counsel put Clay's resignation letter and the Halcyon restructuring notice on the screen side by side. Clean. Dated. Countersigned. No termination. No cause. No grievance. No ambiguity. The vote was 6-1. Neil Pryor was removed as Chief Operating Officer of Alderman Ventures, effective immediately. The Ridgepoint position would be unwound and the capital recovered to the extent possible. The board authorized a formal referral to the SEC for review of undisclosed conflicts of interest in fiduciary investment decisions. Kate stood at the window afterward. The sun was dropping low, and the light across Dallas was the same copper color it had been over the Pedernales River on that Sunday evening with Clay 3 weeks ago. Her phone was in her hand. She called the shop number. Josie answered on the third ring. Tanner's Cycle and Repair, she said, in the careful, practiced way she had heard her father say it. Kate was quiet for a moment. Then, Josie. It's Kate. Hi, Kate. Dad's in the back. He's working on the Bonneville. That's all right. You don't need to get him. I wanted to ask you something. The airplane you've been building, the one from the scrap parts. Is it finished? Almost. I still need one more piece for the tail fin. I'll bring you one, Kate said. She booked a flight to Fredericksburg for that evening. She walked into the shop at dusk. The bay door was still open. The fluorescent light above the workbench cast a pale wash over the tools and the concrete floor, and the two motorcycles parked side by side. Her European bike and Clay's Bonneville, standing together the way they had been standing for 3 weeks now, as if they had always been there. Clay was at the bench with a rag in his hand, wiping down a set of socket wrenches one at a time, placing each back in the drawer in the order it belonged. He saw her in the doorway and stopped. He did not put the rag down. He did not step forward. He stood there, and she stood there, and the 10 feet of concrete between them held the weight of everything that had happened and everything that had not yet been said. Josie came out from the back room. She was carrying the model airplane she had been building for 3 weeks, the one assembled entirely from salvage parts, the wings cut from aluminum sheeting, the fuselage shaped from a length of copper pipe, the landing gear bent from a pair of old spokes. She walked up to Kate and held it out with both hands. I finished everything except the tail, she said. I left the last piece for you. Kate took the airplane. She held it the way you hold something that someone built for you on purpose, carefully, with both hands, turning it slowly to see each piece and understand how it fit together. The aluminum wings caught the fluorescent light. The copper fuselage was warm from Josie's hands. There was a small gap at the tail where the final piece of sheet metal was meant to go. I brought something, Kate said. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small square of brushed aluminum she had found at a hardware store near the Dallas airport. She had cut it to size in the parking lot with a pair of tin snips she bought at the same store. It was not perfect. It was close enough. She handed it to Josie, and Josie held it up to the gap, and it fit, and Josie pressed it into place with her thumb and looked up at Kate and smiled. They walked to Roy's porch. 3 chairs were already set out. 3 mugs of coffee were already poured, 2 black, 1 light with milk, the way Clay always made Josie's. Roy had been setting out 3 mugs every evening since Kate left for Dallas, as if the outcome had never been in question. He was inside now, reading the paper, and when they sat down, he raised his mug through the kitchen window without turning around. Kate sat down. Clay sat beside her. Josie sat between them, holding the completed airplane on her lap, and it was natural, not arranged, not performed, just 3 people in 3 chairs on a porch in a small town in the Texas Hill Country, fitting together the way the last piece of aluminum had fit into the tail of a model airplane. "I'm opening a satellite office in Austin," Kate said. She was not looking at Clay. She was looking out at Main Street, where the light was almost gone. 90 minutes from here. Clay took a sip of his coffee. "That's a long commute. I've made longer rides on worse roads." Down at the end of Main Street, the shop was dark, but the hand-painted sign was still lit, the word repair glowing faintly in the evening air, the peeling letter catching the last light. Kate's motorcycle stood in the bay next to the Bonneville, the two machines resting side by side in the quiet. And beyond the lot, County Road 9 stretched south into the hill country, where the road kept going long after the headlights gave out. She had come to Fredericksburg to disappear. He had come to Fredericksburg to stop. And what they found, on a quarter-acre of gravel between a closed feed store and a retired mechanic's porch, was something that did not require a board vote or a balance sheet or anyone's permission. Some things do not need replacing. They just need someone willing to get their hands dirty.